Hello, class, and welcome to week 4 of the Philosophy of God at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. I am your professor, John Studi, and this week we are going to be covering the first and second way, and these lectures are going to be released in 2 segments. The first segment here is going to be on the argument for motion, and a little bit later today I'm going to be releasing the second segment, which is on the second way, as well as a few objections to the first and second way that are commonly raised by skeptics, and especially ones that are a bit more contemporary, and that you'll be finding when you're actually interacting with other philosophers who do not hold the theistic worldview, who go and criticize Aquinas' 5 ways. And this first argument here, the argument for motion, is Aquinas' most famous argument, easily his most famous argument. Almost everybody who addresses St. Thomas's case for God's existence will go with this one. In fact, you see this exact procedure in the famous Thomist Ed Feser, who gives an amazing rendition of an argument for motion in his books. Which ones does he do it in? He does it in the Life Superstition, his book on Aquinas, and in the more recent book on the 5 ways. Although that book on the 5 ways isn't actually the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. They're just 5 arguments that he's found that are very powerful and ones which people still need to take seriously today. And now often this first way is mistaken for Aristotle's argument, almost seen as a direct copy of it. But as I've mentioned in the past, and as we'll see later in a bit more detail, this is not entirely the case. Now Aquinas' first way, which is the argument from motion, goes something like this. In the real world, we see that things are undergoing some sort of accidental change. A green apple changes into a red apple. Awesome. Well, what's the cause for that? Why are things moving? Well, what we see is Aquinas moves on and he says that anything that is changing cannot change itself. Okay. Therefore, the changing things in the world require an external cause of their change. In part 2, he says there must be a principle or a first cause of a series of changing things. And the reasons he offers for this are that all effects are dependent on causes and must ultimately depend on a principle or a first cause, as the gears depend on a motor, or as the ball depends on the motion of the pitcher's hand in order for it to be accelerating. Therefore, since changing things are dependent, there must be, ultimately, a principal cause of any series of changing things. Part 3 then says the first cause itself must be unchanging. Now, because if the first cause were changing, and then it would need a cause, and thus would be just another dependent thing as a member of this series. But a first or principal cause cannot be dependent in the way that the series is, and so it must be moving. Now, moving on to some of the details of this argument. Part 1 here says that, which is that there are changing things. Okay, well, let's talk about change real quick. And so and it's obvious, again, that we see changing things in the world. And here I'm specifically talking about accidental change. A green apple becomes a red apple, a tree grows, a temperature changes, ball rolls down the hill, a red ball becomes a pink ball. There are countless examples of these accidental changes. But what we need to notice is that whatever changes goes from potentiality to actuality. For instance, the apple changes from green to red. And to reiterate or readdress the nature of change, potentiality, which is one of there's a few different parts for change. You need a potential, an actual, which are going to be the 2 contraries of the change. You need the change itself, and the substratum. Again, the potentiality is what a thing can become given its nature. Actuality is what a thing actually is right now, or what it will be at the end of its motion. Change is the actualizing of potential. For example, it's when the red ball fades or is fading into pink. And when it reaches the end of that process, when it actually does become pink, the motion has ceased. So the motion, again, is about the process. It's the change of going from one thing to another. It's not the actuality on either side of that process. And the substratum of change is, for instance, in the ball or an apple, is in the case of the ball turning from red to pink or the apple turning from green to red, it's going to be the ball or the apple, depending on which ones you're looking at here. What changes is not the apple. And what I mean by that is the apple, in its essence, remains the same, of course, because a green apple that is now red is still the same apple. What's changed is the accident, and so an accidental change, you go from one contrary to another, and the new contrary replaces, in a sense, the first contrary. So when the apple is green, it is an act of being a green apple and having the accidental quality of greenness. When it's changed by it becoming more and more ripe, that green is replaced by the accidental quality of red. And now it's also important for us to remember that the metaphysical focus for Aquinas is on things insofar as they have esse, or an actus essendi, or an active existence. And so in the first way, when we see things undergoing change, what we're witnessing is those things taking on a new way of existing. And that even includes the accidents. It's not just the substances that have esse, it's the accidents that also have esse. And in fact, what Aquinas calls that is in esse, because it has existence in something else. And a thing may exist as a fact, this is important to remember, but the story of its existence doesn't end there. What Aquinas starts off with in all five of his ways is an observation about things that we sense and that we experience, which are ultimately things that are in motion. And it's important for us to remember that esse, again, is not a static fact, but it's something that's progressive and it's continually driving. Esse in things that move, and mobile things, anything physical or material, is always in process. So we're always going towards something else. Whenever you find something, no matter what it is, it's the fullness of its existence is never realized by the thing itself, but it's always on the way to becoming or taking on a new way of existing. It could be changing color, changing size, changing shape. It could be moving from one place to another, moving through time. Whatever the case may be, insofar as the thing does not have a full realization of everything that its existence could accomplish, it's still in motion, existentially speaking. And so again, motion, what we're looking at here, we're looking at motion, not one of the termini. We're not looking at the first contrary and the second contrary. So we're not looking at the green in actuality. We're not looking at the red in actuality as instantiated in the skin of the apple. But rather, we're looking at the change of the apple going from having one kind of color, or existing with the accident of being red, to the existing with the accident of existing apple with the accident of being green, or vice versa, whatever. I don't care. The point is that whatever is in motion in any way is undergoing some sort of existential change to take on a new way of existing. And now Aquinas also says that a potential cannot actualize itself. And so when we talk about the terminus ad quem, so that from which the end, or the contrary from which the thing moves from potency to act, the subject lacks the form towards which they move. The red rubber ball lacks the form of pinkness when it's a red rubber ball. Why? Because the form of redness is there. The form of redness is there in its place, and there can't be two contraries occupying the same place in the same way. It's an impossibility. You basically be saying that a thing is what it is not. And since a thing does not have, since a thing can't give what it doesn't have, right? The contrary, the thing can't, the substance can't give itself the contrary that it lacks. And so the red apple, the green apple can't give itself redness in and of itself without some other factor. Or I think a little bit easier example would be the red rubber ball. The red rubber ball doesn't turn into a pink rubber ball all by itself. It just doesn't have that kind of internal capacity. It doesn't have pinkness or some sort of power to give itself pinkness and to remove the redness. That's not how it works. And so a thing cannot be in potentiality and actuality at the same time and in the same respect. Again, so the red ball does not possess the requisite activity or actuality in order to be pink. Otherwise, it would already be pink, right? So if the red ball was actually pink, then we didn't actually have a red ball in the first place. We had a pink ball. And it wouldn't be potentially pink because it would already actually be pink. So a thing can't be potentially pink and actually pink in the same way, nor can it be actually existing and not actually existing in the same way. You see what I'm saying? And so there has to be an external cause for its existence. External cause for this new contrary, this new way of existing, or new existing in general. And so the ball, when it's red, only has the potentiality of being pink. And what does it receive this pinkness from? Well, again, an external cause. Let's say that it's going to be the sun. Let me get here. The sun. So this is important, and this relates to the fire analogy, which we'll just reiterate it again real quick here. So the cause doesn't necessarily need to be formally identical. For instance, pink, in order to bring about or to actualize potential for some form, say the form of pinkness. Because as long as it can produce the form that we're looking for, so in this case pinkness, then we say that it has the form virtually insofar as it can cause that. So let's take the red rubber ball, for instance. In this situation, the red rubber ball is actually red but potentially pink. And the sun causes the ball to go from red to pink. Now again, the sun does not have the actuality of pinkness, at least not formally, because you look at the sun, it's not pink, it's yellow, or it's yellow. The sun, however, does have the power to produce the pink in the ball, simply by its light and heat through chemical reactions, which removes the dye or breaks down the red dye in the rubber and causes it to return to its original white color, because rubber is whitish in its natural state. So now note something here. This actually wouldn't work with a plant. The sun's light and heat would make that plant grow. But what accounts for the difference? Both receiving the same act, right? Well, here's an important principle. Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. The nature of a red rubber ball differs from that of a plant, right? Because clearly they're not the same thing. And so are its potencies, both passive and active, simply because they have different natures. They are different things. They have a different range of ways that they can exist, either passively, what can be done to them, and actively, what they can do. When the ball receives the light from the sun and the heat, again, its chemical makeup begins to break down. But when the plant receives the heat from the sun and the light, just in the right amount, its formal powers, its soul, and the plant as a whole begins the process of photosynthesis, which, rather than making the plant break down, it actually is good for the plant. Another example of this principle of whatever is received according to the mode of receiver would be a bucket that receives water differently from a swirly straw. Generally speaking, a bucket is going to, when water is poured into it, the water is going to take on the shape of the bucket. Great. When you drink the water out of that bucket through a swirly straw, when you look at the swirly straw, it's going to take on the shape of, well, what? It's going to take on the shape of that swirly straw, and you can't have the shape of a swirly straw in the bucket with the water, nor can you have the shape of the water formed into a bucket in the swirly straw. Why? Because the limits of both of those objects determine the shape of the water. So in the same way, the limits of different natures or different forms determine the shape of existence within each individual existing being. And so, generally speaking, a thing, again, cannot have the actuality to which is in potential. Otherwise, it would be actual, not potential. And thus, a potential can only be actualized by an extrinsic cause. But that cause acts on a thing according to the principles or the nature of the thing with respect to that cause. So, again, the heat is exactly the same way. The heat and light is exactly the same thing from the sun, but it impacts the nature of the red rubber ball and the plant in different ways because they are different things. So a thing is received according to the mode of receiver. To reiterate this a little bit more, the fire, for instance, which is actually hot, is necessary to actualize the potential for the hotness in the wood. Great. But you know two things. First, a fire not only makes the wood hot, but it also makes it burn and turn to ash. And so in each situation, there's actually a primary effect, which is to make the wood hot. That's what it formally does. And so the fire passes on the form of heat to the wood. But because of the kind of thing that the wood is, it also burns from that heat, because the chemical and physical structure of the heat of the log can't handle that degree of heat. No objection. This is what I just talked about before. Does that mean only things which are actually pink can cause the ball to be pink? So again, the heat receives the wood. The heat is received in the wood according to a wood way. So it burns, turns to ash. Where it's something else, water, for instance, it might receive it in a waterish way, which is to boil or evaporate. And this actually corresponds to an objection raised by another medieval philosopher named Anthony Kenny, who was once, I think he actually was once a priest, but he eventually left faith and became an atheistic philosopher or an agnostic philosopher. And one of his primary objections against the first way is that is against this fire analogy. And so what he says is that you don't need a fire to make a fire. Your hands and a stick will do, provided you have enough motivation. Well, why? Well, because you can rub your hands together, and the friction from that actually causes the wood to heat up to a point where it ignites. Okay, that's all well and good, Sir Kenny. But the problem is you're not understanding Aquinas as what he's actually saying here. So the first effect of you moving your hands in such a manner to spin the stick and to cause the wood spin the stick into the wood is the first effect is you're actually moving the atoms, and it's that motion of atoms to a particular resonance or a particular degree of friction that causes the wood to heat up, because physically speaking, heat is the motion of atoms at a particular range, and you get to the point where you're moving those atoms so much that they start breaking apart. It's a combustion, which is exactly what a fire is. And so you're actually taking the form of motion and applying it to the wood. And first you're giving it the form of motion as your primary effect, and then the secondary effect is that of a fire, a flame being ignited. And that's how it works. But it does not at all violate the principle that whatever is moved by another. And it doesn't violate any other principles that are present within Aquinas' first way. Now, there's another objection here that I think is actually maybe even a little bit more interesting. Aren't animals at least a little bit self-moving? Well, this is true, but only in a relative sense, in that the actions of animals begin naturally from within, in a way that's not true of other living things. And so, for instance, what happens with living things is that they can move themselves. So a tree can even crawl around the ground towards, or a tree, or like what's what I'm looking for? A tree, actually, the leaves follow the sun. Same thing with a flower, or vines will creep up a wall or another structure. But living things don't do that. A rock doesn't really do anything. It just kind of sits there and be's heavy. Or higher level animals. A dog smells food and comes running, or it hears the engine of its owner coming home, and so it gets excited and hops up off the couch to go greet the master. So it seems that animals have a certain amount of self-motion that living things do not. But with living things, here's the deal. They don't move themselves in an absolute sense, precisely because with living things, it's one part that moves another, which moves another, which moves another, which moves another, and so on and so forth. But since we're not looking at the formality of motion, but rather the in esse of the accident of motion, what we're tracing is the causes of existence of that motion. Where does that existence lead to? Why does it exist in this way? Why is it in motion? Well, let's think about it. So let's break this down. So my fingers, when I'm typing on the computer, are moved by my nerves, which are moved by my brain, which are moved by my soul. My soul is moved by the will, and the will by the intellect. But the soul only has existence because of its actus essendi, because of the act of existence which causes it to be. in an internal formal sense, or in an internal sense. But the soul cannot cause its own essay, like we talked about last week. So therefore, we need to account for the essay of the soul, or any other, in a human or any other animal, in a way that's external to the soul. And from here, you should start having your suspicions about our next move.